yesterday. President Trump addressed last week's stock market turmoil caused by confusion around his tariff agenda.
It is now becoming clear that tariff increases will be significantly larger than expected. And the same is likely to be true of the economic.
We really inherited a terrible economy, as you know.
What you're about to hear wasn't just a speech, it was a trigger. A single moment, a few words, and the global auto industry, it shattered like glass. In less than 30 seconds, Japan went from quiet ally to economic superweapon, launching a response so precise, so surgical, it caught every automaker in Detroit flat-footed. You didn't read about this in the headlines, but CEOs did. And they panicked, because this wasn't diplomacy. It was a masterclass in economic warfare. So why did Japan target America's most vulnerable industry? What secret move did Tokyo make that even Wall Street didn't catch? And how is it that this one speech may change the way cars are built, bought, and sold around the world? What's happening? In the days following Trump's announcement, there were no fiery press statements from Japan, no angry speeches, no viral sound bites. Instead, the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, known as METI, called a series of emergency strategy sessions with executives from Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mazda. They met in silence. They listened. They calculated. For Japan, emotional response has never been the default. Where the U.S. often reacts with headlines, Japan responds with logistics. Within 48 hours, automakers had begun internal reviews of their North American exposure. Which parts came from Mexico? Which models were most at risk? Could production be rerouted? What would happen to dealership contracts? Toyota was first to act, establishing a cross-functional task force to assess which product lines could be relocated back to Japan or expanded in Southeast Asia. Honda followed with an urgent engineering audit to determine how to lower costs while absorbing potential tariff hits. Nissan reviewed its electric vehicle rollout plans in Tennessee and began modeling alternative pricing for its compact EV line. In parallel, METI began confidential outreach to trade diplomats in Brussels and Canberra, laying the groundwork for future coordination. Japan knew it had leverage. Its expertise in hybrid engines, semiconductors, and battery systems made it an indispensable partner in global supply chains. But instead of threatening, it strategized. The message from Tokyo was clear: do not match escalation with escalation. Match it with excellence. While American headlines asked, why is Japan so quiet? The answer was simple. They were not quiet. They were preparing, and they already knew where the fault line would crack next. The Mexico factory trap. Trump's tariff decree was supposed to punish foreign-made vehicles. But in practice, it struck at the heart of an integrated production model that Japan had spent decades perfecting in North America. One of the hardest hit areas? Mexican assembly plants producing Japanese brand vehicles for American buyers. Factories in Monterrey and Guanajuato weren't backdoors for cheap imports. They were high-efficiency hubs designed to serve U.S. markets more affordably and quickly. Toyota's Tacoma pickup, a fan favorite among American contractors and small business owners, was largely assembled in Mexico. So was Honda's HR-V. These plants employed Mexican workers, yes, but also supported thousands of American jobs in parts manufacturing, logistics, and dealership services. The new tariffs placed a twofold strain. First, they taxed vehicles that were never meant to be circumventing American production. Second, they upended supply chains involving U.S. suppliers providing transmissions, infotainment systems, and steel components to Mexico for final assembly. The assumption in Washington was that punishing offshore production would bring jobs back home, but the effect was immediate and paradoxical. Mexican plants paused operations. Suppliers in Michigan and Indiana faced sudden order cancellations. American trucking firms that transported parts between plants saw business fall off a cliff. Even worse, dealerships began calling automakers in panic. With new vehicle prices expected to rise by thousands of dollars, floor managers feared losing sales entirely. A dealership in San Antonio canceled its summer order of Tacomas. A Houston Honda outlet emailed its regional manager, "We can't sell a $30,000 subcompact. No one will buy." In a bid to force Japanese firms into retreat, the tariffs had trapped everyone, American and Japanese alike. And as the system buckled, the shockwaves had just begun to spread. Tariff shockwaves hit American soil. The first cracks in Trump's tariff policy appeared not in Tokyo, but in Texas. Toyota North America, headquartered in Plano, faced internal chaos. US-based engineers tasked with launching the next-generation hybrid Camry found their parts shipments delayed. Suppliers in Kentucky, who fabricated precision aluminum housings for that model, were informed of postponements. Overnight, the buzzword changed from reshoring to survival. A plastic supplier in Ohio furloughed 60 workers. A Kentucky-based electronics firm canceled a planned expansion. A Mississippi seat manufacturer that built upholstery for Japanese brands announced that their backlog had dried up in less than 2 weeks. These were not foreign casualties. These were American workers, American businesses, and American towns. Local news stations across the Midwest began reporting on the ripple effect. Dealerships started laying off part-time staff. Financing companies saw lower loan application rates. Even trucking companies saw inventory slow. And yet the irony was cruel. U.S. automakers were not picking up the slack. Detroit's Big Three had largely exited the small car market. Their mid-size offerings were overpriced or underperforming. With few domestic alternatives, buyers either delayed purchases or looked to used markets. Consumers were angry, but not at Japan. "I just wanted a car that gets good mileage. Now it's $4,000 more," one Minnesota shopper told a CBS reporter. How is that winning? Behind the slogans and sound bites, the emotional tide was shifting. The policy built to protect Americans was, in practice, punishing them. Jobs were lost, prices were up, and confidence was down. Meanwhile, Japan had not fired a single retaliatory tariff. It didn't need to. The fallout was doing all the work. And back in Tokyo, the real counterstrike was still taking shape. This isn't guesswork. This is verified strategy, global sourcing, and insider panic. Subscribe if you want the real playbook. Factories frozen, factories reborn. When the United States reimposed tariffs on vehicles assembled in Mexico and Canada, the shock was immediate, but the Japanese response was even swifter. Within 72 hours of the announcement, senior executives from Toyota, Nissan, and Honda convened with officials from Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. While the American media was still parsing Trump's talking points, Tokyo had already begun rerouting its manufacturing pipelines. Shipments from Mexico were frozen, production quotas were suspended, and plans buried in contingency folders were activated like war protocols. Toyota halted the next scheduled production run at its Baja California plant. Nissan paused its engine component flow into Aguascalientes. Honda reassigned key supply managers to begin feasibility studies in Southeast Asia. Vietnam and Thailand became the new beating hearts of Japanese automotive logistics. With long-standing trade ties, skilled labor pools, and government incentives waiting in the wings, these countries were not fallback options. They were forward bases. In Japan itself, the rebirth began in silence. Dormant EFI lines, originally scheduled for next year, were brought online months ahead of schedule. Internal teams worked double shifts to revive assembly sectors sidelined since before the pandemic. While many in Washington imagined Japan would push back with threats, tariffs, or WTO litigation, Tokyo responded with execution. Their strategy was not to escalate, but to outmaneuver. And just as the last shipment left the port of Yokohama, a quiet message was delivered back across the Pacific. Japan would not beg for exceptions. It would make itself indispensable elsewhere. But if Washington expected economic retreat, what came next was innovation deployed like a weapon. The innovation gambit. As the tariff war simmered, Japan unveiled its counterstrike, not through legislation or retaliation, but through rapid innovation. Within 30 days of the White House announcement, Toyota released internal blueprints confirming mass production of its long-anticipated solid-state battery technology. Originally projected for 2027, the timeline had been slashed by nearly 2 full years. Prototype modules were already being integrated into low-cost hybrid platforms, tailored specifically for non-US markets, but easily reroutable. Meanwhile, Nissan doubled down on its compact EV platform, accelerating its next-generation Leaf replacement. A nimble, affordable, sub-$25,000 electric vehicle designed for middle-income consumers in Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. In its Tokyo design studios, engineers tweaked charging systems and modular components to bypass American-origin supply chains entirely. Honda, known historically for caution, stunned analysts by announcing a new joint venture with Vietnam's VinFast, pivoting away from troubled U.S. battery partnerships. The collaboration promised ultra-efficient battery production in Da Nang using Japanese tech and Vietnamese scale. The message was clear: where America builds political risk, Japan builds competitive advantage. This wasn't just survival, it was leapfrogging. By turning inward to accelerate R&D, Japan demonstrated what years of quiet preparation could yield. Trump's tariffs had meant to kneecap Japanese exports. Instead, they gave Japan a reason to run faster. Even as Tokyo surged ahead, Detroit was left exposed by its own blind spot. And American drivers were the ones paying the price. America's EV blind spot. For decades, the United States auto industry had been narrowing its vision. Trucks and SUVs became the centerpieces of American manufacturing. Efficiency? Optional. Affordability? Secondary. As global demand shifted toward compact, fuel-efficient electric vehicles, American automakers kept doubling down on bigger, heavier models. When Japanese manufacturers stopped shipping their Mexican-assembled cars, dealerships across the Midwest reported empty lots where Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics once stood. Wait lists grew, prices spiked, and in the absence of Japanese stock, U.S. brands couldn't plug the gap. General Motors had no direct rival to the subcompact EVs rolling off Japanese lines in Thailand. Ford's electrification roadmap had long timelines and high price points. Stellantis, leaning heavily on Dodge and Ram sales, had little to offer buyers seeking budget-friendly electrification. This wasn't a fluke. It was the cost of strategic neglect. American automakers had allowed foreign competition to dominate the affordable EV sector. Now, with Japanese supply chains rerouted and trade relationships strained, the cracks in that strategy became impossible to ignore. Middle-class families were the first to feel it. A $23,000 hybrid, once commonplace, now hovered closer to $30,000 with added fees and delays. Dealerships in California and Arizona reported customers driving to neighboring states just to find Japanese models. Leasing programs backed up. Delivery times stretched into quarters. And as gas prices continued their seasonal climb, the pain only deepened. Detroit didn't just lose sales, it lost credibility. While Japanese engineers innovated, American CEOs lobbied. And in that gap, Japan widened its lead. But the most damaging move wasn't automotive at all. It was financial, and it unfolded quietly, deep inside Japan's central banking and foreign policy apparatus. A foreign policy own goal. The world expected Tokyo to retaliate with tariffs. Instead, it pulled the strings behind the global economy's curtains. For decades, Japan had been one of the top foreign holders of U.S. Treasury debt, a quiet, stabilizing force in global finance. But in May of 2025, that changed. Japan reduced its purchases of U.S. bonds for the third month in a row. The move was subtle, calculated, and executed with surgical restraint. Official statements cited portfolio diversification. But analysts understood the message. Economic trust had been breached. At the same time, Japan's Ministry of Economy initiated trade summits with ASEAN partners and reopened talks with the European Union. In less than 60 days, Japan signed 2 framework agreements to eliminate tariffs on EV components and software exports. None of these agreements included the United States. Back in Washington, the implications sank in slowly. A long-standing ally had begun to hedge its bets. Not with threats, not with embargoes, but with exits. What had started as a tariff battle ended as a reorientation. Japan wasn't just retaliating, it was evolving. And in doing so, it exposed something far more dangerous than a trade imbalance. It exposed how easily American policy could drive its closest allies to seek a different future. Now let's talk about how these tremors didn't just shake trade routes. They fractured the foundation of America's domestic economy. Detroit's silent panic. While headlines focused on Tokyo's swift recalibration, the real panic was unfolding in Detroit. Automotive suppliers who built their business models around long-standing contracts with Japanese automakers began receiving vague emails and postponed meetings. Purchase orders that had been routine for over a decade were suddenly under review. Engineers in Michigan and Ohio, who once built parts for Hondas and Toyotas, rolling off the line in North America, found themselves in a chilling limbo. Mid-sized suppliers, already operating with razor-thin profit margins, could not withstand even a brief freeze in production schedules. Layoffs began as whispers but grew louder week by week. One supplier outside Ann Arbor quietly let go of 65 line workers. Another in Indiana shut down its assembly wing entirely, citing demand volatility. The pain wasn't just financial, it was psychological. These were American workers who, for years, had considered their partnerships with Japanese automakers as stable as steel. Behind closed doors, supply chain directors began triaging resources. Companies that once invested in long-term upgrades shifted to a survival mindset, cutting capital expenditures and delaying any new equipment purchases. Industry insiders spoke of a cascading effect. Canceled contracts meant fewer shifts meant reduced hours, and reduced hours meant less consumer spending in already fragile local economies. This wasn't the kind of collapse anyone could easily headline. There were no spectacular bankruptcies or ticker-tape stock plunges. But for thousands of American workers and their families, this was the beginning of a silent panic, and it all started with a tariff. But the shockwaves didn't stop at the factory gate. The dealer rebellion. Across the country, car dealerships began refusing shipments of Japanese vehicles. The reason was simple: they couldn't sell them. After the new tariffs inflated sticker prices by thousands of dollars, showroom foot traffic collapsed. Models that once flew off the lot now sat under fluorescent lights collecting dust. A new Toyota sedan that cost $27,000 just weeks earlier now hovered closer to $36,000. Dealers were hemorrhaging cash. In states like Texas, Florida, and Pennsylvania, dealership owners started having quiet conversations with their congressional representatives. These weren't liberal activists or policy wonks. These were business-first, typically Republican-aligned entrepreneurs. And they were furious. They had built their entire revenue models around just-in-time inventory and predictable Japanese reliability. Now they were stuck with bloated lots, climbing floor plan interest costs, and a customer base that was increasingly walking away. In response, some dealers slashed prices below cost just to move units, taking the losses on their books and hoping for federal relief down the road. Others began deferring employee bonuses and cutting marketing budgets. A few even closed their doors entirely. The rebellion wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. By the time dealerships stopped reordering Japanese inventory altogether, the message was clear. Tariffs had not brought jobs back. They had brought business to a grinding halt. And while automakers in Tokyo and Nagoya adjusted their global logistics, American dealership owners had no such luxury. Their rebellion came not in the streets, but in inventory management systems and quiet lobbying. And the damage wasn't limited to businesses. The American middle class was about to feel the impact in ways no one could ignore. The middle class squeeze. For the average American household, the tariff war was supposed to be a distant headline, an issue for politicians and CEOs. But as gas prices crept upward and the used car market dried up, the fallout hit closer to home. Families looking for affordable, fuel-efficient vehicles suddenly found themselves priced out of the market. Take a young couple in Kansas City, planning to upgrade from their aging Corolla. Before the tariffs, a new compact hybrid would have cost them $28,000. After the tariffs, $38,000. The same model, the same trim, just $10,000 more expensive because of a policy they had no say in. Their story wasn't unique. Rideshare drivers, delivery workers, suburban commuters all began feeling the pinch. With used car prices soaring due to supply bottlenecks, even older models saw unprecedented inflation. A 5-year-old Civic that once sold for $12,000 now fetched $17,000, and insurance premiums followed suit. This wasn't about foreign policy anymore. It was about getting kids to school, getting groceries, and clocking in on time. The middle-class squeeze transformed the trade war into something visceral, something personal. The question hanging in the air wasn't just, what did Japan do? It was, how do I afford to live in this new economy? And as voters began to feel abandoned, so did their representatives. Republican Civil War. The internal fracture within the Republican Party had been brewing for months, but the fallout from the tariffs made the divide unmistakable. On one side stood Trump loyalists, economic nationalists who cheered the hardline stance against Japan. On the other, farm state Republicans, Great Lakes moderates, and fiscal conservatives watching their districts implode under the weight of political brinkmanship. In Michigan, lawmakers received frantic calls from suppliers and dealership associations. In Iowa, agricultural groups warned that retaliatory trade slowdowns from Japan and its allies were threatening export pipelines. In Arizona and Ohio, suburban voters demanded answers on why car prices had doubled. Behind closed doors, strategy sessions turned into shouting matches. One moderate senator reportedly stormed out of a policy meeting, accusing colleagues of political vandalism. The House GOP conference, once united under the America First banner, now found itself divided between populist loyalists and economic pragmatists. Committee hearings on trade policy became battlegrounds. Lobbyists from both the auto industry and agriculture flooded Capitol Hill with data, graphs, and testimonials. Some Republicans floated emergency measures, tariff carve-outs, temporary subsidies, even foreign investment incentives, only to be shouted down by hardliners warning of appeasement. By mid-year, the rift had reached donors and media outlets. Conservative talk radio fractured. Op-eds clashed. Fundraisers saw canceled checks. And at town halls, voters voiced their confusion. Hadn't tariffs been about helping the American worker? Why did it now feel like punishment? The Republican Civil War wasn't ideological anymore. It was existential. And the deeper it went, the harder it became to hide. But this wasn't just a political crisis. It was a system failure, and one that would echo far beyond election season. The precedent that terrified CEOs worldwide. In boardrooms from Tokyo to Frankfurt, from Sao Paulo to Seoul, a quiet panic began to take root. The American tariff blitz that once seemed like political theater was now codified into policy with real economic teeth. Executives who had dismissed the 200% tariffs as campaign noise were now facing their own reckoning. The implications of Washington's weaponized trade stance weren't limited to Japan. They sent a ripple of fear across multinational industries. In Germany, automakers like BMW and Volkswagen began internal audits of their U.S. exposure. Their just-in-time logistics, heavily dependent on cross-border movement, now looked more like liabilities than assets. CEOs across Europe issued emergency memos to compliance teams. Assess every touchpoint with American ports. Review all North American vendor contracts and calculate cost models under escalating tariff assumptions. For the first time in over 3 decades, the phrase tariff tsunami became a fixture in corporate risk projections. Meanwhile, in Brazil, industrial giants like Embraer and Marco Polo convened internal councils to simulate political trade fallout. Brazil's government quietly requested economic briefings from corporate leaders, exploring potential buffers against a scenario where American tariffs spill into aviation, heavy machinery, or commodities. The question wasn't if America would target them next, but when and how. In Japan, the lessons were being codified into formal doctrine. The Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry issued a new white paper entitled Global Exposure and Political Risk, the U.S. Variable, which advised companies to reroute sensitive production away from regions vulnerable to American regulatory shifts. Insurance brokers began offering tariff risk coverage. Harvard Business School redesigned its international trade curriculum, to include the Trump tariff doctrine as a case study. Across the global business elite, one unsettling truth was now gospel. America had shifted from predictable partner to volatile actor. And while CEOs were recalibrating for protection, governments themselves were quietly redrawing the global map. Global fragmentation begins. Trade used to be about scale, but in the wake of America's unilateral tariff regime, it had become about shelter. Brazil moved quickly, introducing new local content mandates requiring that at least 70% of all automotive parts be sourced domestically for vehicles sold within its borders. In effect, the country began building an economic firewall against external shock. In Japan, trade diplomats pivoted away from further U.S. engagement and leaned into strengthening ties with the European Union. The result? A breakthrough agreement to harmonize EV production standards, streamlining compliance for vehicles sold between Tokyo and Brussels. Japanese automakers, reeling from the Mexico plant disruption, now had a new path, a tariff-neutral corridor with Europe. Southeast Asia followed suit. Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia jointly announced a multilateral trade and supply chain agreement. It was described by one regional leader as a tariff-proof beltway, designed to insulate member states from external trade shocks. Automotive and electronics firms flocked to these countries, not just for cheap labor, but for political stability. What began as a punitive tariff measure in the United States had now triggered the global decentralization of industrial strategy. And that decentralization wasn't temporary. It was being written into law. But this wasn't just a top-down geopolitical shift. On the ground in suburbs and farms and cities across America, the auto consumer was evolving in real time. The new auto consumer: lease or lose. Before the tariffs, Americans were already stretching their budgets to buy cars. By 2024, the average new vehicle loan had crossed $40,000. But with tariff-driven price surges, the dream of car ownership for many families shattered completely. Within weeks of the Japan tariff fallout, leasing rates skyrocketed. Traditional ownership models began to collapse under the weight of unpredictability. Dealerships saw customers increasingly asking not for loan terms, but for mobility plans. Honda and Nissan responded swiftly, launching subscription-based vehicle access programs. Pay a monthly fee, get a hybrid or compact EV with maintenance included. Cooperative fleets began to appear in rural areas. Dozens of farmers pooling funds to lease trucks during harvest season. In cities, startups introduced modular electric vehicle pods, rentable by the hour, with embedded solar panels and just enough range for daily commutes. Even credit unions started adjusting loan products, offering shorter-term mobility financing rather than 5-year purchase loans. In some cases, the only viable path to driving was not to own at all. Culturally, the idea of the car as a personal extension of identity began to fade. What mattered now was cost, uptime, and flexibility. A whole generation began to ask, why buy when you can adapt? But the bigger question still loomed, as automakers, lawmakers, and consumers grappled with a fragile new reality: made in America or made to collapse. The slogans were bold: built here, sold here. But by the time the dust settled from the Japan tariffs, the question wasn't patriotic, it was existential. Were these trade policies designed to protect American manufacturing, or were they unmasking its hidden vulnerabilities? Trump's goal was to reassert control, to punish foreign producers, to shift jobs back home. But in the process, he revealed just how hollowed out America's industrial core had become. Detroit didn't roar back. Instead, it waited. Waited for chips from Taiwan. Waited for parts from Canada. Waited for clarity from Washington. John Deere's turmoil was a warning. Toyota's pivot was a lesson. And the average American car buyer, watching sticker prices balloon while dealership lots sat half empty, was left asking the same question as the economists: who really won? Made in America should mean something. But if production collapses every time a tariff is announced, what are we actually protecting? In the end, Japan didn't retaliate with tariffs. It retaliated with strategy. It out-innovated, out-positioned, and outlasted. And while Washington called it a win, Tokyo simply moved forward. What began as a tariff became a test of industry, a test of government, a test of resilience. And in that test, the answer remains uncertain. None needed. This is the final word, and the beginning of the next reckoning. Is this the future of Made in America? Comment below, and subscribe if you want the truth corporate media won't touch.